Hey guys, and welcome back to Flatpak Effects, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to make this Star Destroyer. Now this video actually came about because I got a lot of requests on how I actually made this Star Destroyer in our Star Wars fan film. Now the techniques that I'm going to show you in this video are pretty much identical to the same techniques that I've already done in a previous tutorial where I add the Death Star into the sky. So for this video I thought I would shoot my own clip and actually run you through from start to finish the entire process and throw in a few new techniques along the way. Now all the files you need to follow along with this tutorial are also available to download for free via a link below. Now I'm going to take my clip and I'm just going to right click and create a new comp from selection. Okay, so I've got my clip in a new composition. Now one of the items I've already supplied for you is an actual sky replacement. So it's basically just this image of a new sky that I want to add into my background here, because as you can see there's no clouds in the sky that I've shot, and this also gives you the option to add in your own custom unique sky into your background as well. So we're going to take our clip here and we're first going to come up to effect down to color correction and add the hue and saturation. Then I'm going to bring my saturation all the way down to -100. Now what we're actually doing here is creating a sky map where we're actually going to take out the light parts of the image and leave the dark parts. So in order to do that, I'm also going to come back up to effect, down to color correction, and I want to add the levels. Now here, I'm just going to grab this bottom one and actually start to drag this up. And at the same time, if I just move this over, I'm going to bring this light part down as well. So now we actually have a sky matte. So we have the part that we want to remove as white, and the black parts are the part that we actually want to keep. So I'm just going to come back to the project here. I'm going to drag a new clip straight onto the bottom. So now we've got the same clip just duplicated without any effects applied to the bottom one. And what I can do here is actually take my sky layer, I'm just going to turn this on and drag it underneath this matte that we've just created. I'm just going to turn this one off for the time being and position my sky so that it roughly covers up that area that we want to replace. We can always readjust this. But then with that layer selected, I'm going to come over to the track matte and change this to Luma Matte. Now if yours is not there, if your track matte setting is not there, just come up here, right click, come down to columns and make sure modes is selected. And there you go. So now you can see that we've added a new sky into the background here. Now I can just select that sky layer and come up to effect, down to color correction and add the hue and saturation. And I'm just going to drag this saturation down very slightly. I'm also going to copy that effect and just apply it to the background. And I'm probably also just going to reduce that even more on that layer, just so we end up with a bit more of a flatter image that's less saturated. So that's the first part of actually doing a sky replacement. Now it's important to note that with my clip that I've used here, I've actually shot it on a locked off tripod. So I'm not panning or tilting when I've shot this particular video. And that is really helpful because it means we don't have to do any tracking to our sky to keep it positioned correctly. So if you do have a shot that is moving around a lot, say you shot it handheld, you'll need to do some basic motion tracking in order to keep the sky positioned in the correct spot. But I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial because there's already a bunch of tutorials out there that show you how to do exactly that. Okay, now we're ready to add in our Star Destroyer. So I'm going to grab my image here and just drag this on top. And now you can actually just reposition this in the sky to wherever you need it to be. So in this case, I'm just going to position mine roughly about here. And we've run into the same issue here where we need to create another matte so we can put this Star Destroyer in behind this tree. So to do that, all we need to do is just take that matte that we'd already created. We're just going to come up here to duplicate and drag this on top of my Star Destroyer image. Now with that Star Destroyer image selected, I can now change this to Luma Matte. So now when I position it, it's in behind that tree. Now at the moment that doesn't look very convincing because the lighting on the Star Destroyer is really different from the scene that we've shot. So to match these, we're going to add a bit of color correction and adjust a bit of the lighting so it looks a bit more realistic. So the first thing I want to actually do is just select that Star Destroyer image and hit T on the keyboard and just drop the opacity down to about 80% here. Then I'm going to come up to the effect drop down, come down to color correction, and I want to add the hue and saturation. Now here, I'm just going to drag this saturation down to about there, and I'm also going to bring this lightness up. So you can see what the lightness is actually doing is adding that haze look to make it look like it's more in the distance. So I'm going to drag this up to around 40 there. We can always come back and readjust these. The other thing I'm going to do is also come up to Effect, down to Color Correction, and add the curves. And here, what we're trying to do is you can see the dark areas here are quite dark, and I really want to bring those up. So I'm going to drag this up very slightly here and drag the highlights down so we get more of an even contrast between the shadows and the highlights. Okay, the last part I want to add here is actually come down to color correction again and add the lumetric color. Now I actually find lumetric color works really well when just adjusting the temperature balance, because you can either warm it up or cool it down. We want to actually drag this the other way, create a bit more of that blue haze. So if I just turn all these effects on and off, you can see how much better that actually looks. It looks like it's much more realistic, like it's sitting in our scene than it did before. Now, the other thing I've also included here is this image of a TIE fighter, and I'm going to drag this on top as well because I want to add this into our scene. I want to add some little TIE fighters that are sort of flying around the outside of the ship to make it look like it's actually video and not a photo. So with my TIE fighter, what I'm actually going to do is shrink this down until I get that size about right. So there looks about right to me. Then I want to take that layer, come up to layer and down to pre-compose. I'm going to call mine TIE Pre-Comp, and I'm going to leave all attributes here on that clip and then hit OK. Now I can actually double click that and we've got a new composition with our TIE Fighter positioned here. Now at the moment the TIE Fighter is not actually moving, it's pretty static. So to add some movement to it, I'm first going to come down to the transform properties and making sure my playhead is at the start here, I want to give my TIE Fighter a little bit of a rotation. So what I'm going to do is hold Option or Alt on my keyboard and just click the rotation property. And I'm just going to type a really basic expression here of wiggle open bracket 2, 10 close bracket, and then click away. And you can see that when we actually play through that, you can see it's just adding a bit more realistic motion of that TIE Fighter. The other thing I'm going to do is do the exact same thing, but for my position. So I'm going to alt click on the position stopwatch. I'm going to type wiggle open bracket 2, 5 close bracket, and then click away. Now if I play through this, you can see that we've got a little bit of movement happening on that position property as well. Now if I want to increase this movement, what I can actually do is just make this happen a little bit faster, and I'm also going to increase that wiggle radius just a bit more so it moves around a bit more around the screen. So you can see it looks quite realistic in the way it's actually moving, and that's all been animated through those simple expressions. Now normally a TIE Fighter wouldn't be flying around by itself, they normally fly in groups of 3. So what I'm actually going to do is take this layer and just come up here to duplicate, and I'm just going to shrink this second one down here, and maybe this first one as well, and start to position them more in a formation like they're actually flying. So I'm going to make these ones at the back slightly smaller, and I'm also going to duplicate that back one again so we get something like that. So it's flying a bit more in a formation. Now the other thing I can do here is actually want this front one here to transition across as they're flying. So I'm just going to come down to the position properties and create a stopwatch for my position property here. And as I move along to the end of the timeline, I want it to fly across to here. So I might actually bring this in just to speed that up slightly so we get something like this. Now at the moment it looks a little bit ridiculous, it doesn't look that great, but keep in mind when we go back to our original comp, these are so small in the background that any sort of movement is just going to help sell that effect as video and look much better rather than being just a static image. The other thing we're going to do with this group of TIE fighters here is I want to actually animate them moving forward. So I can just come down here, down to the transform properties, create a position keyframe at the start of my timeline. And then if I move across, I'm just going to have them move in a straight line forward to somewhere about there. So you can see that looks much more realistic, like they're actually flying. The other thing I'm going to do is come down to my Star Destroyer layer, and I want to copy all of those properties that we already created for the color correction and paste them onto my TIE fighter layer. And I'm also going to come down here for my TIE fighters and just bring that blue even more. And the other thing I want to add to that TIE fighter group is make it a bit blurry. So I'm going to come up here down to blur and sharpen and just add a simple Gaussian blur, and maybe just drag this up to whatever sort of looks best, just to take off that edge to make it look like they're in the distance. Then what I'm actually going to do is duplicate that group and then come up to layer, down to transform, and then flip horizontally. And if I come down to the transform properties, I'm just going to remove that position keyframe so I can move them up here now. And I'm also going to shrink this group down very slightly here in the background and create a new position for them. So they're sort of moving along in the background there. So it makes it look like we've got some TIE fighters on patrol here. Now we could also take our Star Destroyer here and just create a position keyframe at the start and then maybe one at the end, and just have it also moving very slowly across that screen, just again for a little bit of movement. And the last thing I can do here is now add a new adjustment layer, and I can come up to effect down to color correction and add another lumetric color. And you can just mess around by adding a bit of a grade to the overall look. Now, if you need to go through and readjust any of those settings again for each of those layers, just come down to that layer and just adjust whatever you need to add. And that's the basics of how it's done. Now for some of you, a lot of this process will just be a repeat from previous videos, but hopefully there was a few new tips and tricks that you learned along the way. The other thing to keep in mind is that all of this was shot on a locked off tripod, and if you have a moving camera, say you've shot it handheld, you'll need to do a motion track as an additional step before you start. And I've demonstrated how to do this in my Death Star tutorial. So there you go guys, thanks very much for watching. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and I'll catch you in the next tutorial.